time you saved me and Big Pun's life. Do you remember it, Mike? I know you're on mushrooms right now. Pun is arguing with this one dude. Then it turns to 2 dudes. Then it turns to 3 dudes. Then it turns to 4 dudes. And I'm arguing back with them too. Next thing you know, Mike Tyson, the main one that started, Mike Tyson starts chasing him around a car, trying to him up barefoot. And the security looks at me, Joe, stop him.
So, picture this. It's 1995. Mike Tyson, the youngest heavyweight champion in history, is 29 years old and still an absolute force of nature. If there was ever someone you'd want backing you up in a sticky situation, it'd be Tyson. This was the same man who had already cemented his place in boxing history and was known to be as intimidating as he was loyal to his friends. That loyalty came into play one night when he ended up saving Fat Joe and Big Pun from what could have been a serious beatdown.
We turn around. It's Iron Mike Tyson. This is like 2 in the morning with the kufi on. He had a suit on, and he starts taking off his Gucci loafers.
Now, Fat Joe and Big Pun were tight with Tyson despite coming from completely different worlds. Joe and Pun were hip-hop giants, repping the Bronx with hits on the charts, while Tyson was a sports legend with a reputation as the baddest man on the planet. Despite their differences, they had a bond that went beyond the spotlight. They always had each other's backs, and one night at a notorious club called The Tunnel, Tyson proved just how far he was willing to go for his friends. If you don't know about The Tunnel, let me set the scene. It was one of the wildest, most infamous clubs in New York City during the 90s. This wasn't the kind of place you strolled into unless you were about that life. The bouncers were huge, dangerous-looking dudes, and the crowd was just as intimidating.
Now, The Tunnel was a club in New York where you couldn't be in there if you wasn't dangerous.
Right.
This was
2 bullet minimum, huh?
Yeah,
Okay.
2 bullet minimum. Their bouncers make you look like a baby. These guys would jump off the roof like these was Transformers, right?
This was a spot where beefs popped off regularly, and if you didn't have street cred or muscle, you'd better think twice before stepping in. So Big Pun decides he and Joe are hitting The Tunnel. They roll up ready to party, but as soon as they hit the door, trouble starts brewing. The bouncers stop them and tell Pun he has to take off his boots so they can check for weapons. Now, Pun was a big guy. He weighed close to 600 pounds. Taking off those boots wasn't going to be a quick or easy thing for him, and Pun wasn't the type to take orders like that anyway, so he starts arguing with the bouncers.
They tell him he got to take his boots off. Now, I just told you Pun was like 580 pounds.
Right.
He couldn't really take his boots off like that. So he was like, nah. But in there, people used to sneak in knives and guns and they
At first, it's just one bouncer pressing him, but soon, it's 2, then 3, then 4, and eventually 5 bouncers squaring up. Fat Joe, being the loyal friend he is, jumps in and starts backing Pun up.
Pun is arguing with this one dude. Then it turns to 2 dudes. Then it turns to 3 dudes. Then it turns to 4 dudes. And I'm arguing back with them too.
But Joe isn't blind to reality. These bouncers were massive, and the numbers weren't in their favor. Joe starts thinking, man, we might actually get our ass handed to us here. Even though he and Pun had guns stashed in their car, they knew there was no chance they'd make it outside to grab them before these bouncers pounced. But Pun? He didn't care. He was heated and started hurling insults, refusing to back down. Joe, seeing his boy going all in, keeps standing by him, ready to ride it out. Then out of nowhere, they hear a familiar voice cut through the chaos. Yo Pun, yo Joe, F these dudes. They turn around, and who do they see? None other than Iron Mike Tyson himself, standing there with this wild look in his eye.
So now, out of the 10, it's like 8 of them.
Right.
And out of nowhere, you hear a voice like, yo Pun, yo Joe. We turn around. It's Iron Mike Tyson.
He had been watching the whole thing go down and decided it was time to step in. Before Joe and Pun can even react, Tyson starts kicking off his Gucci loafers, getting ready to throw hands. Now, if you know anything about Tyson, you know he doesn't play. And keep in mind, this was just a week after he'd been released from prison. But Tyson wasn't worried about going back to jail. His friends were in trouble. And that was all that mattered. The moment his shoes came off, Tyson locked eyes with the bouncer who started the whole mess and took off after him, barefoot.
Next thing you know, Mike Tyson, the main one that started, Mike Tyson starts chasing him around a car, trying to him up barefoot. And the security looks at me, Joe, stop him. Mike Tyson might have came out of jail 1 week.
Yeah.
Like this was him fresh out of jail. Right out of Indiana.
Now, Mike standing up for his friends like that was absolutely applaudable. But you know how people love to speculate. Some folks started saying that maybe Mike's anger that night wasn't even really about the bouncers. They think the poor guys were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. See, Mike had just gotten out of prison, and he'd been locked up for a crime he always swore he didn't commit. That kind of thing builds up a lot of frustration and anger in a person. So according to these theories, when Mike saw things escalating at the tunnel, it wasn't just about backing up Joe and Pun, it was about letting out all that pent-up rage. The bouncers just happened to be the unlucky ones who triggered it. On July 1991, Tyson was arrested for the R of Desiree Washington, a 18-year-old contestant in the Miss Black America pageant and former Miss Black Rhode Island.
An Indiana grand jury has indicted former heavyweight boxing champ Mike Tyson. He is charged with raping a woman who was a contestant in this summer's Miss Black America pageant.
The incident allegedly occurred at the Canterbury Hotel in Indianapolis, where Washington claimed Tyson had SA'd her after inviting her to his room.
I had no intention of doing anything with him, and I didn't think that he had any intention of doing anything with me. This man who was my father's hero, who was a celebrity, would want to do something like that to me.
According to Washington's testimony, Tyson called her at around 1:45 a.m., asking if she'd like to take a tour of the city. She agreed, and he picked her up in his limousine, eventually taking her back to his hotel room. Washington said they talked for a while as they sat on the bed, but when Tyson propositioned her for S, she firmly refused. She stated that she went to the bathroom to compose herself before leaving, but noticed a discharge on her panty shield, which she removed and threw away. When she came out of the bathroom, she said Tyson pulled her to the bed, pinned her down, and R-worded her. He was mean, evil, she testified. I got on top and started to try to get away, but he slammed me down again. 3 days after the incident, Washington went to the police to report the alleged R. Her claims were partially supported by testimony from Tyson's chauffeur, Virginia Foster, who said Washington appeared to be in a state of shock following the incident. Foster also testified that Tyson had previously tried to SA her, attempting to lure her to his hotel room, touch her inappropriately, and expose himself. The prosecution further bolstered their case with testimony from Dr. Thomas Richardson, an emergency room physician who examined Washington after the incident. He reported that Washington had sustained 2 small V abrasions consistent with SA. While he admitted that these injuries occurred in only 20–30% of SA cases he had seen, he emphasized that such injuries were rare in consensual encounters based on his 20 years of medical experience. Tyson, however, adamantly denied the allegations, claiming the encounter with Washington was entirely consensual.
Desiree Washington knows what happened in the room. I know what happened, and I know I'm in it.
During the trial, his lead defense lawyer, Vincent J. Fuller, argued that Washington had willingly engaged with Tyson, but the defense's strategy was heavily criticized, even by Tyson himself in later years. Fuller, who had a strong reputation as a lawyer specializing in white-collar crimes, was an unusual choice for this type of case. His background in federal court cases like tax fraud and bribery didn't prepare him for the challenges of defending a high-profile criminal case involving SA in a county court. Observers noted that Fuller fumbled with exhibits, appeared unprepared, and failed to effectively challenge inconsistencies in Washington's testimony. Critics of Tyson's defense also questioned why Fuller didn't address key details, such as why Washington removed her panty shield or how Tyson could have pinned her down while allegedly performing oral S. The defense strategy also backfired in other ways. To argue that Washington should have known Tyson's intentions, the defense brought forward witnesses who described Tyson's crude and lewd behavior during his interactions with Miss Black America contestants, including Washington herself. Instead of helping his case, this only painted Tyson in a negative light, reinforcing the prosecution's portrayal of him as aggressive and entitled. Ultimately, the jury deliberated for nearly 10 hours before finding Tyson guilty of R on February 10, 1992. He was sentenced to 6 years in prison and an additional 4 years of probation. Tyson began serving his sentence at the Indiana Youth Center, now the Plainfield Correctional Facility, in April 1992. While in prison, Tyson's life took yet another turn. He spent his time reflecting, reading, and even getting tattoos. He left prison with notable ink, including portraits of tennis player Arthur Ashe, Chinese leader Mao Zedong, and revolutionary Che Guevara. Tyson later mentioned that these tattoos symbolized his complex thoughts and interests during his incarceration. After serving less than 3 years of his sentence, Tyson was released in March 1995. The experience left a permanent mark on his life and career. Alright, let's backtrack for a second because not everyone sees that night at the tunnel the same way. Yeah, Mike Tyson showing up to save Fat Joe and Big Pun was a legendary move, no question. But some folks are saying, did they really even need saving? Or better yet, even if they did get beat up by those bouncers, it might have been the bouncers who ended up regretting it. Why? Because Joe and Pun weren't just rappers. They were about that life. See, Fat Joe and Big Pun didn't build their reputations off fake thug life bars. They weren't just rapping about the streets. They came from the streets. Their credentials weren't just talk. They had real weight behind them. Even industry legends like Tony Yayo and 50 Cent have vouched for Joe's street credibility. And if you know anything about those two, you know they don't hand out compliments lightly.
I would go with Fat Joe.
You couldn't even walk up to Fat Joe back in the day.
Yeah, I would say Fat Joe on them.
Tony Yayo once said straight up that Joe was the real deal. That's a big statement coming from someone who's seen it all. And 50 Cent, even during his infamous beef with Fat Joe in the early 2000s, a feud that had some of the nastiest diss tracks we've ever heard, he couldn't help but acknowledge Joe's respect and influence in the streets. He might not have liked Joe, but even 50 knew better than to downplay the man's reputation. In an interview, 50 talked about how people feared Fat Joe and the Terror Squad. He even compared Joe to the New York version of Suge Knight, which is wild considering how heavy that comparison is. He admitted that Joe's presence in New York was no joke, and even said something along the lines of, "The funeral homes were making bids." Translation: anyone who dared to go head-to-head with Joe and his crew better have had their affairs in order. And Yayo, he doubled down on this. According to him, the realest beef G-Unit ever had wasn't with some random rappers. It was with Fat Joe and the Terror Squad. He described Joe as the kind of guy who didn't need to yell about his power because people already knew. Yayo even said, "Yo, the realest beef was with Terror Squad, he was a real N. I gotta give it up. The realest beef was with Fat Joe and them. We outside." Coming from a guy who's been in some serious situations himself, that says a lot. But here's where it gets even deeper. There are whispers, unverified of course, but intriguing, that Fat Joe's influence in the streets wasn't just about him being a tough guy. Some say his reach went way further. There are conspiracy theories floating around that suggest Joe wasn't just a gang leader, but might have been connected to figures so powerful even law enforcement hesitated to mess with him. The kind of figures who operate on a global scale, in places where street crime and international crime start blending together.
I had a friend that his brother was like the biggest drug kingpin in the biggest, right? And me and him was super cool.
Allegations like this aren't just thrown around lightly though. There are stories about backdoor deals, corruption, and connections so deep that they could explain why, despite all the chaos surrounding his name, Joe has managed to avoid serious legal trouble for decades. People start wondering, is Joe just incredibly lucky, or is he playing some next-level chess game no one else can even understand? And honestly, it's not hard to see why fans might believe that. Joe's longevity, both in the music industry and in the streets, doesn't feel like a coincidence. Think about it. How many rappers from that era are still respected and thriving like Joe? It's rare. He's managed to navigate an industry that's cutthroat and unforgiving while keeping a reputation that even his rivals have to tip their hats to. Fat Joe wasn't just some rapper trying to make a name for himself. He was the mastermind behind one of hip-hop's most infamous crews, the Terror Squad. People called them the Spanish G-Unit, but they were so much more than just a music group. This wasn't just about dropping hits or climbing the Billboard charts. The Terror Squad had a split identity. Part rap collective, part street powerhouse. Their name carried weight not just in New York, but in places far beyond the Bronx. Joe and his squad brought a whole new level of rawness to the game, mixing the energy of the Bronx streets with their music. But here's the thing. Their reality wasn't all about the studio or the spotlight. Their reality was survival, ambition, and for some, straight-up domination. Rumors followed them like a shadow, with whispers about enforcers, extortion, and under-the-table deals painting them as more than just artists. They were a serious force to be reckoned with. That name, Terror Squad, wasn't just a flashy brand or a marketing gimmick. It was a statement. It carried this air of intimidation, a reminder that they weren't to be messed with. According to those who claim to know, their influence went way beyond hip-hop. They were said to have ties to the streets, not just in New York but in other places like the Dominican Republic. Some people even suggested that they had a stronghold there, making moves that blurred the lines between rap dreams and street operations. Fat Joe wasn't just the face of the crew. He was the guy pulling the strings. Stories about his leadership style make him sound like a kingpin. He wasn't just about keeping the group together musically. He was about protecting their interests in every sense of the word. Members of the squad weren't just his collaborators. They were loyal to the core, ready to handle any disputes, and not always with words.
From the Bronx, what I realized is them just a different kind of breed. Dominican, Puerto Rican, Ecuadorian, Mexican, the Dominican, Puerto Rican niggas, they just another type of breed. They would have died for Joe.
The stories that back up Joe's street cred are as hardcore as they come. Take, for example, the time he survived a near-fatal shooting. At first, people thought it was just another rap tale, blown out of proportion for clout. But then insiders started confirming it, and suddenly, the story took on a whole new level of authenticity. This wasn't just some random incident, it was a chilling reminder of the line Joe walked between fame and real danger. But Joe's leadership wasn't just about defending himself or his crew. His rise to fame brought plenty of beefs, and not the kind that stayed on wax. In the early 2000s, beef often spilled over into the streets, where the stakes weren't just about who had the hottest bars. It was about survival. Joe and the Terror Squad didn't back down from anyone, whether it was industry rivals or street-level threats. They had a reputation for handling their business, and people took that seriously. Now, of course, there's always been a question of how much of this is real and how much is exaggerated for the sake of the story. But time and time again, different sources have come forward to back up the claims. The stories of Joe running the Terror Squad like a boss, surviving shootings, and clashing with hip-hop giants have all been corroborated by people who were there. Even his rivals have admitted Joe's reputation wasn't just hype. And then there are the darker rumors, the ones that live in the shadows of his story. Tales of secret deals, retaliations, and even whispers about Emder charges have only added to the mystique around Joe's reign. Some people believe the Terror Squad wasn't just a rap collective. It was a well-oiled operation mixing music, money, and muscle in a way the industry didn't want to talk about. So yeah, with all this in mind, it's pretty clear that if those bouncers had laid a hand on Fat Joe and Big Pun, there's a good chance they would have ended up regretting it.